So some of the earliest big theories in CSR concern ritual, and actually were an attempt to deal with the diversity of ritual around the world. Again, this is a very basic CSR strategy. Let's look at what seems like wild surface diversity, but try to identify underlying patterns. And so the argument of these major theories was that when you look at the diversity, it seems overwhelming, but actually if you analyze it, you can see that in the logical space of the form rituals can take, they're not randomly distributed throughout that space. In fact, they tend to cluster in corners or kind of attractor spaces. And that is because these attractor spaces have very different types of functions. One of these big theories was Lawson and Macaulay's ritual form theories. So they began with a definition of religious ritual that was very schematic with different slots. So in their view, you have an agent, so somebody who's doing something, that's the actor. They're doing something, so there's an action, that's the second part. And they're doing it to someone called the patient, so the receiver of the action, the person who's receiving the action, with the goal of bringing about some sort of non-natural consequence or result. So this is their definition of religious ritual. In their view, the regularity in ritual arises from the fact that these you only have these certain slots, and they're going to get filled by different types of entities. The most crucial of these differences is where the supernatural agent's getting slotted in. Is it the actor? Is it the one doing the action? Or is it the patient? Is it the one receiving the action? In their view, this actually accounts for a lot of the diversity of religious ritual. So let's talk now with one of the founders of this theory, Robert Macaulay, who will explain how he and Tom Lawson came up with this idea and what the major features of ritual form theory are.
The notion was that even if you just have a fairly simple model, is there anything that is different about religious ritual? And Lawson and I decided, at least hypothesized, and sort of ran with that hypothesis, that really the only thing that's different is sort of what kinds of things get inserted in the slots. And this is commonplace, which is to say that some of the things that pop up in religions are agents that have some special properties. And if they get stuck in these slots, in either as agents or as patients, if you start looking at the patterns involved, what struck us was there were all sorts of fascinating systematic patterns that ended up very nicely and compactly providing an account of a whole range of features about rituals that scholars of ritual have been pointing out for 150 years, right? I mean, people will notice, for example, that some rituals are rituals that you sort of do more than once, which is to say some rituals are repeatable rituals, some aren't. Some rituals are reversible rituals, and some aren't. These and a variety of other properties, it seemed to us, sort of sorted out very systematically relative to sort of where, in short, the gods, or derivatively, where sort of the gods' representatives, so to speak, got slotted into these scripts for the actions, for the ritual actions. In short, ritual form matters, and it matters in terms of people's understanding, people's knowledge, people's tacit knowledge, that is to say, mostly unconscious knowledge about what they know about their ritual systems. So we drew a distinction from the very outset between what we've subsequently ended up calling special agent rituals in contrast to, let's just say, all the others for now. The pattern that we detected is that any ritual for which this seems the appropriate description, turns out these are the rituals that you don't repeat. Typically baptized only once. You are typically ordained only once. And what struck us about these was that, in effect, the gods are the agents. They're doing something to you, okay? And the notion is, gods only need to do this once anyway. I mean, if they can't, they're pretty sort of mediocre gods, right? If the god next door could do it only once, and this guy takes 14 tries, that would be pretty telling. So then another pattern, frankly, early on struck us as well, and that is these special agent rituals are precisely the ones that in any given system, relatively speaking, where the volume gets turned up, so to speak, in the ritual. These are the hot rituals. These are the exciting rituals. And indeed, when you think about, what kind of associations do people have with ritual? Well, it seems to me there's sort of two, right? One is, oh, ritual, this thing that I do very occasionally in my life designates benchmarks in the course of my life that are absolutely crucial and pivotal, surrounded by friends, family, often, not always. That's one association we've got with ritual, but we've got another association with ritual, and that is ritual. This boring stuff that I do every day, over and over and over again, exactly the same way. Those are two very contrasting patterns, and indeed, Lawson and I argued that the ritual form hypothesis captures and is able to show you exactly that those two patterns are out there and why they're out there.
Another of these early big theories about ritual types was Harvey Whitehouse's modes theory. Now, like Lawson and Macaulay's theory, the idea is there are attractors behind the diversity, apparent diversity of religious ritual types. There's actually clear categories of rituals. In Whitehouse's view, these attractors are, on one hand, the doctrinal mode. So in the doctrinal mode, we have rituals that are being done frequently. They're being done daily or many times a day, and they're characterized by low emotionality. Low affect. You get up, you do this ritual every morning, maybe you do it again in the afternoon and the evening. And this mode of ritual he contrasts with what he calls the imagistic mode. So in the imagistic mode, you've got a lot of emotion. These are typically rituals that are not done very frequently, they're very infrequent, they're special, and they're characterized by high arousal, a lot of emotions involved in these rituals. And in his view, these two different types are having two different functions. So the doctrinal mode is good for getting people to learn things, learn things that you want them to learn. So they're repeating it constantly. It's a good way to learn theology, so complex theology. This is a way to internalize it. It's a good way to internalize ritual practices in a standardized way. So the doctrinal mode is going to favor centralization and orthodoxy. On the other hand, you have the imagistic mode. So these are these highly arousing, very infrequent rituals. In Whitehouse's early views, that this had really focused on a memory effect, so flashbulb memory, kind of take a snapshot of this moment and we keep it with high fidelity. Now, in his view, this has got a very different function than the doctrinal mode. So what this is doing is binding people together in small groups. This is also going to give rise to what he called spontaneous exegesis. So people have this very powerful experience and they want to explain it, and they're going to start explaining it in any way that seems to make sense to them or their own small group. Maybe they'll debrief and talk about it. So it's a very powerful theory that you've got these two kind of modes that are in a sense in tension with one another. And all religions maybe go through phases where they focus on, they emphasize one over the other. More recently, proponents of the modes theory have been focusing less on these memory effects, so less on things like flashbulb memory, and more on this idea of identity fusion. So focusing more on the role that the imagistic mode, these kind of intense and often dysphoric experiences, might have in really tying people together into groups that cooperate closely. So let's turn now to Dr. Whitehouse. We'll talk a little bit about the origin of modes theory and fieldwork he did in Papua New Guinea, and also this more recent emphasis on the role of dysphoric ritual and identity fusion.
The people in the village in Papua New Guinea where I did my fieldwork were all members of a religious movement calling itself the Kivung, which means a meeting, which is premised on the central idea that the ancestors of the group would soon return from the dead bearing all the amazing wealth and technology associated with European colonial invaders. This would sort of result in a period of bliss and paradise on earth where people would no longer suffer injury, illness, childbirth, and all the sufferings that we know go along with life. But to bring it about, they had to perform lots of specific rituals. And so I became fascinated by this whole system of beliefs, and that became really the focus of my research, taking over from the original focus on economic anthropology. This Kivung movement had really two dimensions to it. On the one hand, it had this vast popular movement encompassing many, many villages that emphasized particular doctrines and particular practices that needed to be maintained in precisely the same way across many, many villages. And in order to accomplish that, they performed their rituals and repeated their doctrines publicly on a very regular basis. You could then standardize the tradition across a really wide area and have a stable orthodoxy that united a large population. But at the same time, there were small cults within this large organization that had a very different kind of profile in terms of their rituals. They occurred, first of all, very infrequently, and they also involved a lot of emotional arousal, particularly dysphoric or painful or frightening aspects. They seem to be producing very intensely cohesive but rather small groups where the ideas were difficult to spread, and even if you could spread them, difficult to standardize. But at the same time, people who performed these kind of rare, intense rituals seem to have the impression that other people going through those experiences shared something really fundamental and important. It sort of broke down the boundary between the personal self and the social self. And later, I met the social psychologist Bill Swan, who introduced me to his amazing ideas about identity fusion. And I realized psychologically this is what I'd been studying for a long time. And now it became necessary to integrate these theoretical frameworks. But very little was known about what caused identity fusion in the first place. We gradually came to the conclusion that fusion was a product, well, of sharing something important and salient with other people, and that sharing probably came about through the experience of living in families, right? It's your family members who provide you with the most profoundly salient shared experiences, and most people are fused with their families, even if with no other group. But it also seemed that some institutional arrangements seemed to act like gadgets to create the same sense of shared history, sometimes in a much more efficient way. Because if you go through a very intense ritual with a group of people, the experience can feel incredibly salient, incredibly significant, but actually take quite a short space of time to assemble in comparison with the many years that it takes to build fusion in families. And I think one of the key features of identity fusion is that a sort of functional equivalence between personal and social self, so that when somebody attacks your social identity, it feels like a personal attack. And that also means that fusion has consequences for what we call outgroup hostility and parochial altruism, the idea that you are of willingness to pay a big price personally for the sake of a group cause.
It's important to point out, and this really gets again to I think what's distinctive about the CSR approach to religious studies. We've got these two different theories. We have ritual forms theory, we have modes theory. They actually make different predictions in different situations. And then you have people going out in the field and testing them. This is what's different about CSR. We have theories and they get tested and people change their mind. I mean, people are people. People get wedded to their own theories. People are very reluctant to give up on their theories, but they do. It's happened in the field that people gradually back off certain theories that don't seem to be justified by the evidence. So on that note, we'll conclude Module 4. Now in our next module, Module 5, we're going to expand on this idea of empirical testing. So far a lot of what we've seen in terms of testing hypotheses against evidence has involved contemporary populations, so experiments in the lab or observations in the field. What we're going to turn to in Module 5 is, I think, a relatively newer approach in the cognitive science of religion, trying to get beyond contemporary populations and test hypotheses about religious belief and behavior against ancient texts, archaeological records, data from traces of people who have lived in the past.